The three legs of it are the science, the scientific evidence, the coach's experience, and the athlete's experience, and also the athlete's desire. That Triathlon Show, episode 109. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host, Michael, and today's episode is a solo episode where I will teach you how to use sports science and how to apply it in practice. So I will talk about interpreting research, what you should be looking for, how to recognize bad research, and most importantly, talk about the fact that it most certainly is only one part of the puzzle, and there are other very, very big parts that come in that are not necessarily research or science based when it comes to planning your training and your triathlon performance in general. So we'll talk a lot about how to do that and how to strike the right balance. And definitely you should not be doing what some might do and use the, in my opinion, very overused phrase evidence-based as a shield. That's a big no-no. But first, let's thank our sponsors. This episode is sponsored by Precision Hydration. Andy Blow, who was on episode 49, is the founder of the company, and he recently wrote a great blog post on whether your hydration strategy needs to change as you get older. So that's interesting for all the masters athletes out there. And in a nutshell, 3 factors suggest that older athletes need to be more diligent with their hydration than youngsters, because the margin for error is reduced and the risk of dehydration is increased for this demographic. The reasons being that you have less water on board to start with, so this increases the risk of dehydration. You also tend to lose more water through your urine, so dehydration is again increased, or the risk of dehydration, I should say. And finally, your sensation of thirst is actually diminished. This is something that I talked about way back in episode 20. So again, that risk increases. And if you are looking for the best electrolyte drinks and products out there on the market that can be tailored for your individual needs, then go to precisionhydration.com. You can get your first box for free by using the code THATTRIATHLONSHOW, all one word, all caps. This episode is also sponsored by Triathlon Corner, a triathlon web shop on triathlon-corner.store that has you covered with everything from wetsuits, running shoes, bike computers, to power meters. And right now, all That Triathlon Show listeners can get 10% off all purchases, any products, by using that same discount code, That Triathlon Show, all one word, all caps, on triathlon-corner.store. And remember that if you're in Helsinki, they have a great brick and mortar store with an indoor bike studio where they do group workouts, and of course you can shop there in the brick and mortar store as well. I'm sure if you ask nicely that the discount code That Triathlon Show will apply as well in when you go shopping physically. Alright, so let's move on to the main topic of today, how to correctly use sports science and apply it in practice. So the first thing that I want to talk about is that it most definitely isn't a case of you being able to finding the solution just by reading a lot of research and optimizing your training plan based on that. It doesn't work like that at all. I like to use the analogy of a three-legged stool when it comes to how you should plan your training and anything really that goes around your sports performance, like nutrition, recovery, etc. And that three-legged stool, the 3 legs of it are the science, the scientific evidence, the coach's experience, and the athlete's experience, and also the athlete's desire. So let me explain what that means. So the scientific evidence is pretty straightforward. That's what we'll talk about a bit more later. But just as important is the coach's experience. If the coach has coached a lot of athletes and says that this usually works for athletes like you, then I mean it makes no sense not to try that approach if we're talking about a training intervention, for example, because the coach has seen that work time and time again. So you should not discount that just because there might not be any evidence for that approach. And the same thing goes for the athlete's experience, but also what the athlete wants to do. I mean, if the athlete really, really detests running on the treadmill or riding on the indoor trainer, and they have the opportunity to ride and run outside year round, for example, then even if the coach may be a big proponent of treadmill running and indoor bike riding, then maybe it's in the best interest of the athlete's performance to not actually have that, because they might get bored, mentally burned out, and mentally fatigued. So all of these three things, again, scientific evidence, coach's experience, athlete's experience, and desire come into play here. The athlete's experience, again, is very important, especially for the more experienced the athlete, the more important this becomes. I ask a ton of questions from my experienced athletes that I coach about what they think has worked for them in the past, what hasn't worked, and those sorts of things. It should always be a two-way communication that way. So you have this three-legged stool, and you don't want one leg of the stool to become too dominant, because then the stool will tip over, basically. That's in this analogy. So when it comes to using science specifically to plan your training or whatever, don't use that the scientific evidence and again the term evidence-based as a shield, and don't be the guy who only uses research and not experience and actually looking at what's happening in the real world to your performance or to the whatever it is that you want to improve. You're missing out on so much if you're only using that 1/3 of those pillars. So the way that I think that you should measure things. If we're talking performance here, like triathlon performance, test frequently and measure your performance, but also measure other things that can be like performance in benchmark sessions. We have talked about a lot of different options that you can measure on other episodes, so I won't go into detail on that. If you use Training Peaks, you have some great dashboards that can show you, for example, your 20-minute or 5-minute or 1-hour power on the bike and how that has progressed month over month. So it's pretty easy to do that these days. And so what I do, for example, with in my coaching is that I have a big spreadsheet with one tab or one sheet for each athlete that I coach, and I have a list of all sorts of tests that we do, but also races. They can be triathlons, or they can be running races, or cycling races, or other key workouts. And when an athlete does a key workout or a test, I add those details to that spreadsheet, so I can then and then I keep adding to that row. So, for example, on one row I have an FTP test, and then I add onto that row every time that the athlete makes a test. I write the date, and I write the power and the average and maximum heart rate, and sometimes some other details if it's important. So I can easily in that spreadsheet overview exactly how things have progressed, and then I can correlate what happened between this month and 2 months ago when we had this development, this progression, or in worst case scenarios, this regression, and why is that the case? So definitely you need to be measuring, and that way you can find out whether your use of the 3 legs of the stool, the scientific evidence, the experience, whether that's correct or if you need to change things. And that can be in either one of these legs. Maybe the coach, in this case, the experience that the coach has is not applicable for this particular athlete, or the science is not applicable for this particular athlete. And that second thing, the science, that's something that we'll talk about a lot just a little bit later. So that's about it. I should say that there is no one right way to train. There isn't. You can't find a right way to train by reading every single research paper that is out there. There are way too many variables and too many confounding factors. We will never find an answer, not in our lifetime and not in many lifetimes, to if there is a best way to train. So that's one of the main reasons when you put it in simple terms, that we need to combine the scientific evidence with the art of coaching or with the experience, so to get the best results. That's what we're after. We're not after being evidence-based, we're after performing well. So keep that in mind. That's the big picture, and it's the main thing. And as you know, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And on this podcast, the main thing is always performance. Oh yeah, now I just remember that one more thing that I want to mention on this topic is that you should be open and honest about what the reason for any certain training or nutrition or recovery intervention is. Is it based on research or is it based on your experience? Both are fine, but you don't want to be the guy either who goes around and says that you do all sorts of things that are evidence-based if you're really doing it because you like it based on your own experience, or maybe you've heard somebody or a lot of friends having good results. That's a perfectly good example to try something, but be clear and be honest about whether something is based on your experience, your coach's experience, or on research, and be open and honest about that. All right, so let's move on to the next phase, the next segment of this topic, and that is interpreting science, interpreting research studies. There are a few main things that we really need to consider here, some terms, and those are study design, statistical significance, and effect size. So I'll keep this simple. I won't go all sciencey on you. I'll do my best at least, but in any questions that you may have, go and comment in the comment section on the show notes page, and I will answer every single question that you post there. And I'm very quick at answering those questions actually that you post in the comments. So that's on thattriathlonshow.com as usual. But okay, so study design, statistical significance, and effect size. In terms of study design, just to keep things very simple, we have different grades of how good, how well designed a study is, and how much credit you can give to a study based on its design. So I'll not cover all different variations that there are, but just so you're aware that case studies or even expert opinions, those are like the weakest grades of scientific evidence. So, but they're still valuable when you add them to other research studies that are out there and to your own experience. So don't discredit them, but be aware that they're not as valuable as other more reliable study designs. So then somewhere in the middle, you have a non-controlled study. So you have just one experimental group. So for example, let's say that you have 20 runners and you want to see if adding 2 runs per week to their normal 4 runs per week schedule, so they will increase from 4 to 6 runs per week, if that will improve their 5K time. And then so all of these runners will add 2 more workouts to the weekly schedule. They will do a baseline test before and after the study, and then you will see the results. Are the results in the 5K times statistically significantly different? Yeah, I got it right. From after the intervention compared to before the intervention. So, but the problem here is that you don't have a control group. You don't have a group of runners that keep doing only 4 runs per week, so that you can compare the difference. Because otherwise, you may find, if you have a control group, because that's the best type of study design, when you have this control group, you may see that actually these runners also improve just as much as the runners that added 2 workouts per week, just because maybe the population is like really new runners, so they've only been running 4 times per week for a couple of weeks. So it's not really a surprise that all of them will improve whether they're running 4 or 6 times per week. So that's why a controlled study with a control group and a randomized control study especially are the best types of study designs. So the next term that I mentioned, statistical significance, that's used to see if, because there may be there will always be a difference between groups, almost always. In that above example, let's say one group improved their 5K time by 1 minute and the other group improved by 30 seconds or even 59 seconds. There's still a difference, a 1 second difference. But if it's a 1 second difference, you probably can't say that one method, adding 2 runs, is better than not adding any runs, because there is going to be variations and variance in basically in the sample. So that's why you need to use statistical methods to estimate if it's likely to be due to chance or due to an actual true effect. And usually the way statistical significance is used is that it basically tells you if you repeat this test 100 times, then 95% of the times you will find that actual effect, but 5% of the times you won't find it. So that's basically, you usually draw the line at 95%, and you're happy with that, because otherwise it will be really, really difficult to find statistical significance anytime unless you have a study of a lot of people, and that's really difficult for funding reasons and other reasons as well. But it's important also to keep in mind that this is a composite score that is based on the actual true difference. So let's say, for example, that the true difference here is actually 20 seconds. So you win 20 seconds by adding 2 runs per week to your training regime. But that's just one part of statistical significance. The others are the variability. So that is, some people may improve by 10 seconds, some not at all, some by 40 seconds, some by 1 minute. So there is a variability, and the bigger that variability is, the more difficult it is to get statistical significance. And the sample size also comes into play. So if you repeat that same study and you get the exact same difference, but one study has more participants than the other, then the study with more participants might find a statistical significance, but the one with fewer samples or fewer subjects, I should say, they won't. So that's basically how you use it, and that's why just because a result isn't statistically significant, it doesn't mean that there isn't an effect, but also it doesn't mean that there is an effect. It just tells you kind of the likelihood based on the variability of the phenomenon you're researching and also the sample size of this study. The effect size, finally, in this case, it's that difference in 5K times that we talked about. So if you can say that one group improved by 30 seconds and one group improved by 5 seconds, then put simply, you can say that 25 seconds is the difference here. And if you found a 25-second difference on a 5K, and you also find statistical significance, that is a good thing. But if you find in another study that the effect size is 10 seconds, but it's still statistically significant, then that effect size is pretty small. So even though there might be a true difference there, is it worth adding those 2 extra miles, 2 extra runs with the increased injury risk that comes from it, if potentially the effect size is just 10 seconds? That's how you need to think about these things. Keep in mind that not all research is good research. Study design is one factor that we already mentioned, but also the interpretation that the authors make is not always good, and that goes for anybody interpreting the research. That goes for myself and anybody reviewing and reading research, of course, but the authors can also make mistakes. They're not gods, they're normal people like you and I. And these days, there are a lot of journals out there that are actually pretty easy to get your studies accepted into. So, and that means that somebody, if they have a biased opinion about something, they're going to dig up a poor study and just to support their view and say that, hey, there is evidence for this. And then somebody else is going to pick it up and post it on social media, and suddenly you have a media frenzy and a hype. And so that's one of the risks these days, and one of the problems with poor research and the ease of getting some research studies accepted in journals. Some other things to keep in mind here is that research shows what happened and if it was due to chance or not. It does not predict the future. Just because you had a difference in running performance between the two groups, where one increased their to 6 workouts per week, it doesn't mean that the same thing will happen in the future if you do it or if somebody else does it. It's for one thing, there is the variability that we talked about. So it might be true on average, but not for every person. But it's also very, very contextual. So there are a lot of variables that goes into this. So, for example, things like the demographics. Are these college students or are they masters athletes? And what's their background? What's their ability? Like, what's their current fitness level? All these sorts of things. And also, like, what did they do? Did all the college students go to CrossFit the day before the 5K time trial the second time around, or were they ordered to stay home at rest and they all had the same food and the same amount of sleep? That's a very different story. So if you have, just because you have a positive research result, it does not mean this is how you should train. It means, first of all, you need to put it in context. You need to read the research and know what the context was. And if the context seems applicable to you, then it means this may be a method worth trying to see if it works for me. But remember that there is still that variability inevitably, so it might not work for you. There is no such thing as a fact. And about that context, because that's super important, this is a general piece of advice for you. If there is evidence, like a study that is really, really, the demographic is exactly what like you are, and all the things that they did in the research applies to your life and how you train, etc., then if you have even 1 or 2 studies that have good positive results with a decent effect size, then it may be worth trying that. But on the other hand, if you have 1 or 2 studies that show good positive effect sizes, but the context is very, very different, then you need to probably put the bar a bit higher in terms of how much accumulated evidence you want there to exist before you try something. But that again comes down to your philosophy. If there's no potential harm and some potential benefit, then yeah, you might try it, and still don't call it evidence-based, but you can try it for sure. Whereas some people might think that, especially if it's an investment of time, or there might be some other factors, that some downside to trying something that you've read about in a research study, then some people have the philosophy that you need to know that there's no potential harm or minimal potential harm, like injury, and really high likelihood of success. So that means that you need a lot of repeated studies that have shown the same thing, and they have shown the things in the demographic of the athlete and the context of the athlete's life. So this thing that comes down to, don't just read the abstract. That's super important, and that's a mistake that a lot of people do. They read the abstract and then they think that, hey, I should try this because they found some sort of result. Almost any published research study, unfortunately, find results. Often, sometimes research is not even published if they don't find any results. So that's a problem. And other times they test a lot of different things, a lot of hypotheses, so at least something is going to show some sort of result, and that may be it may be due to chance, even if they had statistical significance. So, and it may be something that a phenomenon that's not really important to you. They may find that, okay, so you have reduced lactate levels in your second 5K time trials. time trial compared to the first, but so what if your time didn't improve? But some people get hung up on the fact that they found a positive result, like lower lactate levels. I don't think that that's important. So you need to know what the actual result that the study shows is about. And so, yeah, read the entire study. Two final concepts that I want to talk about is external and internal validity. I mentioned it a little bit with the example of some people, the college students going to CrossFit the day before the second time trial, or in the second study, hypothetical study, they were ordered to stay at home and rest and have the same meal as everybody else, meals, I should say. And so that's internal validity, is how well a study is controlled internally. So how well they manage to control for different variables like recovery, nutrition, those sorts of things, sleep, time of day, equipment. There are tons of things that can be controlled, and any potentially important lurking variable, if you can control for it, it's good. But at the same time, there's also this term external validity of a study. So if you control for everything in a study, let's say hypothetically that you could do that, then I mean, if you want the same results as the study, then you would also need to apply that to your life. So you would always need to have the same nutrition and the same not going to CrossFit, all these things for it to be contextual to your life. So external and internal validity, they are kind of in a constant battle against each other. So ideally what you want is you want a good amount of internal validity, but then you want it repeated across multiple studies, and they control for slightly different things so that you cover the spectrum and you still get those positive results each and every time, which kind of gives external validity over time to that entire phenomenon across different controls, different contexts. So that's very important to keep in mind. Final points. Nothing is a fact, even if a lot of studies have shown it. Research, there are error bars in research papers for a reason. And again, it comes down to that variability. And also, research is often behind practitioners. So don't discredit practitioners just because if they say that you should do a certain strength training exercise, for example, and that hasn't been really shown in research to improve strength or improve performance, well, it doesn't mean that they're wrong. It can potentially mean that it hasn't been tested yet. So the next point after this, so this was the technical part, and I promise that now we'll get less technical, at least. Still quite philosophical, I want to say. But this is about individualization, and humility. So we really have to understand that in most cases we don't know anything. And I have done a lot of things in coaching, and even at times when I've been self-coaching, that are directly against science, against scientific evidence. Because my goal and the athlete's desire is, and their athlete's goal is to improve that athlete's performance, not to throw that athlete in a bucket of the average research subject. So we need to individualize. It's simple as that. A smart athlete that's self-coaching, or a good coach that's coaching an athlete, of course they will tailor things for the individual. That's super intuitive to get, but that means that sometimes you actually may have to go against what scientific evidence may say, at least according to some people. Other people might interpret that scientific evidence differently. But individualization here is key. So be very humble about that, and especially when you're looking at what another athlete is doing. So if your friend is doing something and you know a lot about research and you think that that's not evidence-based, it may be for a reason that they're doing that. Their coach may be actually looking at what changes in the athlete's performance that they get from certain types of training, and they may be adapting. Hopefully they are adapting the training to that individual response, and not just reading all the research and then they have a ready-made template of exercises that they just throw at the athlete that's just based on research but doesn't take into account the response of that person. So this is not, of course, an excuse not to stay up to date and know what the research says and what the evidence says about all sorts of topics related to triathlon. I definitely think that constantly reading and educating yourself, at least if you're a coach, otherwise you may leave it to your coach if that's not what you're interested in, that it's a must to do that. Absolutely a must to understand these things and have a good grasp of it. And if you don't, then it's pretty easy to spend a couple of hours with somebody. I'm sure you can find a nice PhD candidate who has a couple of hours. Invite them to dinner and they will explain everything about how to invite me for dinner and I can explain it to you. But anyway, I think that education and staying up to date is super important. But still, that individualization needs to come first. And that's why we talked about the three-legged stool at the beginning. Scientific evidence, coach's experience, and athlete's experience and desire, and also having that measurement of performance. So this is a slight side note, but I just read it the other day on Facebook again. I'm again going to rant about Facebook groups and triathlon Facebook groups specifically. And because I mentioned that humility earlier, and this is something that I never see on Facebook. I always see just know-it-alls, and so I didn't even get involved this time, thank God, but I just shook my head and banged it against the wall a couple of times when I saw this thread. It was somebody posting their training plan for an Ironman this coming summer, and it was from the base phase. It was like, I don't know, 4 or 5 month plan or something, and basically how they were going to train throughout their build to the Ironman. And there were a lot of comments, and I didn't see anything necessarily wrong with that program, to be honest. I think that it could be perfectly reasonable to train the way that athlete trained. It wasn't something that was extremely out of the ordinary, but everybody commenting on that post, they were pointing out flaws and errors in that poor guy's plan. And it's not just in this case. I rarely see in these similar kinds of posts, or whether it's social media or otherwise, somebody commenting, hey, that looks good and smart, and yeah, that might work very well. It's always pointing out flaws and errors, and they're either basing it on their own experience or their view of scientific evidence, which often isn't honestly very great, but they don't consider that they're not that individual. They don't even know that individual. So it's just crazy, and I think that this accepting that we need to be super humble with these things and how little we know, and knowing that it's all based on the individual. That's super important. That's just what I want to get across with this story. And so in this example again, there are a lot of people that said that the plan was too hard. And that's just one example. I bring that up because that's a trend that I see. It seems trendy for people to say that other people are overtraining. I don't remember the last time I heard somebody say that another athlete is not training enough, even though I would estimate that if we talk about fulfilling athletic potential for 95% of triathletes at least, it's not training enough that's the problem, not overtraining. And that's for obvious reasons, because you don't have time in your busy life to train as much as you would need to fulfill your athletic potential. But still, I mean, that's a much more common problem than overtraining, especially if we talk about clinical overtraining syndrome. So that was, again, a bit of a sidetrack, but yeah, I think it's an illustrative example of how I think that we should always try to be aware of how we're thinking about things, and be very, very humble about this, because we really don't know shit in my purest French. So, okay, final segment: applying these principles in practice. So step number 1 is to know what your goal is, because how you use science and experience will be much different if you want to qualify for Kona compared to if you want to complete your first sprint triathlon. And you also need to know your objectives. So what do you need to achieve to accomplish that goal? So an objective might be to you need to raise your FTP a certain amount to be able to have a chance of qualifying for Kona, for example. So knowing that goal, knowing those objectives needed to achieve the goal, that's important. Second, you're not managing that which you aren't measuring is a thing that a famous saying from the business world initially, I believe. Again, my example with that giant spreadsheet, that's me trying to manage, to measure so that I can manage how my athletes train and hopefully help them improve as best as possible. And you should do the same if you're self-coached or your coach hopefully does it for you otherwise. So make sure that when you're trying a new, let's say that you're trying polarized training, then when you start changing your training, do a baseline test before and then say that, okay, I'm going to give this 8 weeks, and then I'm going to retest and see where I'm at. That doesn't mean that you need to, if you don't progress, that you need to abandon the idea, but you need to have a good reason if you want to continue. So you need to be measuring and know why you're doing certain things and manage by measuring simply. And then when you want to include something that you've found in research, let's say that you want to start to train fasted or whatever it is, something that you find some interesting research about, then the way that you incorporate this is you need to look at the accumulated scientific evidence available, but also the accumulated experience available. So ask your coach. If you're self-coached, ask as many coaches and athletes as you can. Read on the internet, read about anecdotal evidence, and form a hypothesis for how this will help you and how much this will help you. So will it help you 0.5% or will it help you to a 5% performance improvement? That's very different. Is it worth your time if it's 0.5%? Maybe not. Maybe you could focus your time and energy on something else. Is it worth it if it's a 5% improvement? Heck yes, it probably is, because that's a whole lot in endurance sports. So that's, you need to, again, consider the best use of your time and energy. If even if something may improve your performance, if there are other things that may improve your performance more, then that's maybe what you should focus on. So this is, and then you need to go deeper, not just look at study result, but on the context. Is this applicable to you? As we talked about, are the demographics very, very different, etc.? Can you actually do the protocol? Let's call it heat acclimation, for example. That's a good example. They have very specific protocols that you need to follow. Is that something that you can carry out in your home or wherever you want to carry it out, in a heat chamber at a university lab? What do you have the resources and whatever you need to be able to carry out a certain intervention? So yeah, that's important. And consider the context, again, going back to that internal and external validity. And also especially if you find the intervention that you want to try from not directly from a research study, but from, for example, an article, be very, very critical of the source. The best thing is to go and read the research study directly, read all of it, not just the abstract. And if you're reading it just in a magazine or a newspaper, it doesn't mean that it's wrong. There are some great authors writing for magazines, like, for example, you have Matt Fitzgerald writes for Triathlete magazine a lot, and he's really, really good at this. He knows his stuff. So if you need to read a Matt Fitzgerald article, if I read a Matt Fitzgerald article on Triathlete, I tend to trust that. But if it's some other author, it depends. There are other good ones as well. But then there are people that I either don't know or people that I've read things that I think is bullshit. So I don't trust them. I lost my trust in them. So you need to be careful and you need to have a filter on because it's very easy in these articles for the author to misinterpret the research. And the same is true all over the internet, of course, on blogs, on podcasts. I'm absolutely sure that I've done it myself on multiple occasions on this podcast. and I will do it again in the future. But I do my best, and I have a pretty good background to be able to minimize these mistakes. So I would say that this podcast is a relatively good source. That's just my 2 cents about it. But for sure, I make mistakes if the authors that are or the researchers that are doing the study can make mistakes in interpreting, as I mentioned previously, then for sure I can do that as well, and anybody can. Be aware of your bias. That's something that we talked about in episode 104 with Dean Gollish. It's very, very easy to find one study or several studies that supports your view, which may be biased. So try to play the devil's advocate, and how can you kill your own idea? And that will give you a much better, much more objective basis for if you are going to do a certain intervention or not, and apply something that you read in research into practice. And finally, if you're coached, talk to your coach and ask them questions, and make the suggestion that if it seems reasonable that you do this intervention that you read about. If you're self-coached, talk to many different coaches, talk to other athletes, get ideas, get feedback. The better questions you ask, the better answers you get. So don't ask, what do you think of this? Because then, again, as I said, the chances are that people are going to be negative and give you just negative feedback. But if you ask, what do you think is good about this idea? And what do you think is bad about it? Or what do you think are the potential benefits and the potential disadvantages? Then you will get already much better answers that will help you get a more objective view of what you're trying to achieve. I think that's about it, really. I'm sorry that this episode was... I was rambling a lot. As I always do in these solo episodes, I try to be organized. I have my notes here in front of me. But I still get off on side tracks, and then I kind of forget what I've already said. Key takeaways here: the three-legged stool, scientific evidence, coach's experience, and athlete's experience and desire. Not all research is good research. Don't just read the abstract. Remember, the context of research is super important, and those terms external and internal validity. And finally, I would say that another key takeaway is that statistical significance is a composite score. It's not the be-all, end-all answer for if something is good or bad. It's a composite score based on actual difference, variability, and sample size. Something may work great for you and still not statistically significant in any study, or the other way around. So keep these things in mind. As always, you can find the show notes on thattriathlonshow.com. And once again, if you have any questions, comments, then please post them in the comments section and I will answer them. Also, another thing, piece of house cleaning item here. I got some emails from listeners that were asking about how to submit listener questions to specific guests. We've had them, for example, recently on interviews with Hunter Allen and Stacy Sims. And the way that I do that is on my Facebook page, Scientific Triathlon. Go and like it. That's where I usually, before I do interviews, I will sometimes, not always, I forget, but sometimes I'll post that I'm interviewing X, Y, and Z. So if you have questions for them, please ask, and I will ask them on the interview. So go and like Scientific Triathlon on Facebook to be able to do that. In the next episode on That Triathlon Show, I interview Tom Hughes from the United Kingdom on TryMechanics.com, and his business is called TryMechanics as well. He's an expert in running biomechanics. That will be a really, really fascinating episode. I'm interviewing Tom tomorrow, and I really can't wait. I'm on the edge of my seat. I have a feeling that it will be a long one, so it may actually break down into 2 different episodes. We'll see. But stay tuned for that. That's coming up next. Finally, thank you to our amazing sponsors who keep this show up and running. First, we have Triathlon Corner, the new online home of shopping the best triathlon products in the world to great prices. They have brands like Garmin, Stages Power, Café du Cycliste, Zip, Mako, Zone Free, Hoka One One, and all sorts of great brands. They're very selective about them, kind of like me and my guest. I talked to Jan about this, and yeah, that's a funny thing that we found that we had in common. And they ship worldwide, of course, and you can get 10% off your next purchase when you use the discount code That Triathlon Show, all one word, all caps, on triathlon-corner.store. Thank you also to Precision Hydration for sponsoring this episode. Remember to take their free online sweat test on precisionhydration.com. This will give you a personalized hydration strategy for your next race, before, during, and even after the race. And you can get your first box of Precision Hydration product for free when you use the discount code That Triathlon Show. Again, all one word, all caps, on precisionhydration.com. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.